Welcome to the IAH Hydrogeology Time Capsule. My name is Geoff Freeze. I'm a research engineer at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with over 25 years of experience in hydrogeology. The focus of my work has been on groundwater remediation studies and performance assessment analyses and radionuclide transport modeling of nuclear waste repositories, including WIPP and Yucca Mountain. In those 25 years, I've had the privilege to interact with a number of well-known hydrogeologists, including some who are the subject of other time capsule interviews. But today, it is my pleasure to conduct an interview with the hydrogeologist that I've known the longest, my father, Dr. R. Allan Freeze. Welcome to Sandia. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get started?
Well, yes, I'd like to start with a few thank yous. I specifically would want to thank Craig Simmons of Flinders University in Australia and Philippe Renard of the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland for encouraging me to make this video. They are the two folks that are most responsible for getting the Time Capsule website up and running, and those of us in the hydrogeological world who like to see our history preserved owe them a debt of gratitude. I also want to thank Sandia National Labs, Geoff's bosses, for providing the funding, the studio facilities, and the technical backup to carry out this task. And lastly, I'd like to thank Geoff for being willing to carry out a father's somewhat unexpected request to help put this thing together.
So I guess it makes sense to conduct the interview in chronological order. So why don't we start at the beginning? Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Edmonton, Alberta, in Canada, in 1939, just before the start of the Second World War. I've always felt I was incredibly lucky in the sort of time and place that I was born. Canada turned out to be a great country to live in and raise my family and have a career. And my timing was good because, my parents, of course, had to put up with the dirty 30s and the Depression and fighting in the Second World War and so on. People born when I was born seemed to avoid all that. We had pretty good times most of my life. I was too young to go to Korea and too old to go to Vietnam. So I felt I had pretty good timing. Those first few years of my life were the war years, and my dad joined the Royal Canadian Air Force shortly after I was born. He was a navigation instructor, and we lived most of the first 6 years of my life in Air Force towns in the Canadian prairies. My first memories come from Souris, Manitoba, a little town in southern Manitoba, and we also lived in Brandon, Manitoba, and Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I was, I guess, a kind of a military brat my early years.
And after the war, where did your family settle?
We settled in Calgary, Alberta. My dad was an architect by training. He had finished his degree in architecture at the University of Alberta before the war, and after the war he took a job with the Department of Public Works of the federal government of Canada, and in fact he worked for the federal government for his entire career. And of course, moving up through the ranks, that took us sort of slowly but surely towards Ottawa, the capital of Canada. We lived in Calgary for a few years. Then we lived in Toronto. I was sort of in grades, about 5 to 9, I think, when we lived in Toronto. By the time we moved to Ottawa, I was in high school. And my parents lived in Ottawa for many years thereafter as I traveled around and went to college and so on, but I sort of thought of Ottawa as my home during those years.
Do you have any brothers and sisters?
Yep, I got one brother, Rick. He's 10 years younger than I am, so my parents used to always say that they raised two only children. He's now a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba. I think I was pretty lucky. My parents had a very happy marriage. I literally never heard a crossword between them. They were both influential in my life. My mom was a charming lady. Everybody loved my mom, including me, and she was the one I went to when I wanted to talk out my problems, whatever they might be. My dad was the one who, in a sense, set my kind of life view of things. He was quite a free thinker, a bit of a socialist, always supported, in Canada we have three political parties, a liberal, conservative, and then a kind of a quasi-socialist party to the left, and he was always on that side of things. Both he and my mom were always very compassionate towards people that had less than we did, and they certainly imbued my brother and I with those kinds of thoughts. I also remember that around the dinner table, there was always a lot of open discussion, and nothing was off limits. We talked about politics and sex and life and love and whatever came up, and I was encouraged to express my opinions and so on. I guess those that know me in later life will say, yeah, he expresses his opinions.
Well, thank you for not spending too much time on politics at our dinner table. Instead, I know we spent a lot of time talking about sports. Tell us a little bit about your interest in sports.
Well, I always had a lifelong interest in sports. I guess as a kid I was a jock. I played most organized sports. Hockey was my favorite. I played hockey well into my 40s. Of course, you'll remember as our young family, we skied a lot. I still golf 2 or 3 times a week. It's been a big part of my life.
So after high school, you went to college at Queens and then Berkeley. Tell us a little bit about your undergraduate work at Queens.
Yeah, Queens University is in Kingston, Ontario. It's a couple hours drive from Ottawa, and it seemed like most of the kids in Ottawa high schools who sort of were good at math and science or interested in math and science tended to head off to Queens and go into engineering or science. And I know I had a high school math teacher, Mr. Sonley, and he used to take all of us guys aside that he thought had the potential to become engineers or scientists, and he pushed us in that direction, and I've never been sorry that he did. Once I got to Queens, I was in engineering, and like a lot of engineering schools, the first year was common. So you got to make your decision of what branch of engineering to go into after the first year. And I was highly influenced there by a geology course that all of us took from Professor Jolliffe. He was a real Pied Piper for geological engineering. Back in those days, there was a lot of classwork and labs and so on. I think we spent something like 36 hours a week in class and labs. But somehow there was lots of fun too. I took part in a lot of intramural sports, and there were dances, and I had a group that played poker once a week and so on. Of course, that's also where my wife and I, Dawn and I, got together. We actually had gone to the same high school in Ottawa, but we didn't start dating until we got to college. And we actually celebrated 50 years of marriage just this past year.
Well, I'm glad you met your wife, Donna, there. It certainly was good for me as well. So you mentioned Professor Jolliffe as sort of sparking your interest in geological engineering. Was there some things that happened that got you further interested in geology?
Yeah, there's a couple of things I guess I can think of that got me going in that direction. When I was still living in Toronto as a young high school student, my best friend was Norm Keevil. Now that name may not mean a lot to a lot of the people that are watching this, but in Canada people know Norm Keevil because he's one of the richest men in Canada. He went on to become the CEO of Teck Corporation, which is the biggest mining company in Canada. In actual fact, his father started that company, and it started by his father discovering an ore deposit in the Lake Temagami region of northern Ontario. And they had a cabin on an island in Lake Temagami. And Norm used to take me and other of his best friends up to Temagami in the summers for a couple of weeks. We swam and paddled canoes and fished and stuff up there. It was wonderful. But we also saw his dad and all the other geologists kind of roaming around the country, and it looked very exciting. It looked like a kind of a life that I would like. Of course, as it turned out, I got into a branch of geology that didn't involve roaming around the North Country forever, and I'm glad of that too. The other influence I had, when I was at Queens, one of the first summer jobs I got was with Shell Oil. It was a summer job. It took me up to northeastern BC, almost on the Yukon border. Our party chief there was a Swiss-German geologist named Peter Ziegler. He actually later became quite famous in Europe because he was the author or editor of the sort of standard Geology of Europe book that came out some years later. In any case, our job there was to climb up and down the mountains and gather rock samples and work out the stratigraphy of the sedimentary rocks in that part of British Columbia. And one of the things that Peter Ziegler had us watching for was any kind of repetitions in the stratigraphy, because that usually implied that there was some kind of a thrust fault had brought the rocks, one set of rocks over top of the other, and it would be the same set of rocks on top of each other with just a very thin thrust fault plane between them. So one day he took us out and showed us one of these thrust planes, and of course I was amazed because this thing was only about a foot wide. It was made of fault gouge, sort of clay, and he had us put our geological hammers and kind of jam into them and show that it was just sort of a gouge. And then he explained that this 1,000 feet of rock had somehow pushed its way over top of the underlying rocks. And I don't think at that time I maybe spent that much thought about how this had come to pass, what kind of physics would allow 1,000 feet of rocks to be shoved over top of another 1,000 feet and not just make them all crumble. Of course, it turned out I learned next year back at Queen's that mystery of geology had just been solved the year before by two American scientists, M. King Hubbert and William Ruby. And they had written a famous paper in the GSA proceedings that explained the role of the pore pressure in the fractures of the rocks. That is, the pore pressure of the groundwater, really, the pressure in the groundwater. So that was my first sort of introduction to some of the magic of groundwater and to M. King Hubbert. But of course, at the time, it never entered my mind that I'd be essentially building my career on the shoulders of M. King Hubbert's work.
So it sounds like, as you said, that was sort of your first introduction to groundwater. Was there some jobs or some further courses that got you, hooked on groundwater?
No, I never took an undergraduate course in groundwater hydrology. I was a geological engineer, but at that time that wasn't thought of as something that deserved any special treatment. I think I got a few lectures on it in a hydraulics course I took. But anyway, when I was ready to graduate in 1961, I interviewed for a lot of jobs, of course, and a couple of jobs took my interest, and I had to decide which one to take. One was a job with a consulting engineering company in Niagara Falls, actually. And I suspect if I had taken that job, I might never have gone back to grad school. I don't think I had any burning desire to, further my education at that point. But as fate would have it, Dawn and I were planning to get married at Christmas of that year, and she got a job offer as a teacher in Ottawa. And the other job offer that I had available was in Ottawa with the Geological Survey of Canada in the Groundwater Division. So I went in without knowing very much about it. It just sounded kind of interesting, and I suppose the main reason I took it was because it looked like it would make the planning for our wedding easier. So such are the way decisions make that change your life. When I got into the Geological Survey of Canada, what I discovered initially was that the groundwater division there was a little bit of a backwater, if truth be known. It wasn't a place that the management didn't consider it one of their leading groups by any means. It was kind of a place where people went after they had finished their careers elsewhere. And that all changed, luckily for me, that all changed in the first year I was there with the arrival of a Dutch scientist named Peter Mayboom. Peter was just an enthusiastic, charismatic leader. And the second he arrived, he became, in a sense, the person that became our mentor. He was probably only 4 or 5 years older than me, but he really was enthusiastic about groundwater and the chance that we had at the GSC to build a good program, and it was a very lucky thing for me.
Tell us a little bit about your first assignments at the GSC.
Well, my very first assignment was when I arrived, they kind of dumped a bunch of boxes of raw field data into my office and said, "Can you do something with this?" Keep in mind, I'd never had a groundwater course. It turned out that a long-standing member of the GSC had retired, kind of in mid-job, and he had been looking at the groundwater resources in Saint-Jean-Lachine, which is just south of Montreal in the province of Quebec. So my first job was to kind of weed through these boxes of data and see if I could make a report out of it. And I did, and that became the first thing I ever published, I guess, was a GSC report on the groundwater conditions in Saint-Jean-Lachine. My second assignment was to be the assistant to one of the fellows in the groundwater division. His name was Joe Tremblay, a French-Canadian, and I was also in Quebec. We were in the Vaudreuil-Soulanges area, which is just also near Montreal. And I went out, and that's where I really learned the beginnings of groundwater. I remember that we ran a big pump test out there, one of the kind that lasted for several days, trying to assess what the resources were of a sand and gravel aquifer there. The problem was, it turned out that it was an artesian aquifer, and we hadn't realized that ahead of time. And the initial well that was drilled for the pump test started flowing, and we hadn't made arrangements for that, and we had water all over the place. And it was a pretty exciting few days, I might say. But we got it under control, or Joe did, and the pump test went off. And I still remember being out there in the middle of the night making measurements. We did everything manually at that time, putting tapes down the piezometers and so on, and it was quite exciting. After I'd sort of had my mentorship from Peter and Joe, after about a year there, I was decided that I could look after a project on my own, and they sent me out west to the Old Wives Lake Drainage Basin, which is in southern Saskatchewan. I had as my assistant Miles Parsons, a hydrogeologist who became a lifelong friend of mine, and the two of us worked away on the Old Wives Lake Drainage Basin. I have to tell one story about Peter Mayboom. When I first arrived out there, of course, I was still pretty raw, and I had a couple of assistants that had been assigned to me, young undergraduate summer students. So the three of us piled in our government truck, and we headed up about 50 or 100 miles north where Peter Mayboom had his field area. And we arrived there about supper time, and no way we were getting supper, because Peter was going to take us immediately out to his instrumented field site. He was studying the role of sloughs. We call them sloughs in Canada, ponds that are in the Canadian prairies, the glaciated Canadian prairies. And really nobody had ever looked at these sloughs before Peter did to decide whether they were recharge areas or discharge areas or what role they played in the hydrology of the province. So he had instrumented the slough, and he took us out there, and we bounced across the farmers' fields in his truck, and we arrived at this slough just at dusk. It was getting dark, and there was mosquitoes, and it was about 100 degrees in the shade. And he put on his hip waders, and he waded out into this mucky slough, and he pulled a chart off an old Stevens recorder, and he brought it out to us, and we're all swatting at the mosquitoes and sweating to death, and he showed us this thing, and he said, "Isn't this wonderful?" So that was Peter and his kind of influence on us.
So I'm curious, you talked a little bit about doing pump tests and not having much groundwater experience yet, so you were collecting data. Were you also responsible for analyzing the data at that time, or was that left to somebody more senior back in the office?
No, I was on my own. I was busy reading books, and of course the time I spent actually 3 years in the Old Wives Lake Drainage Basin, and those coincided with the years that I went back to Berkeley as a grad student, and now I was getting groundwater courses, and so it was very much earn while you learn time.
All right. So you mentioned Berkeley. What made you actually decide to go back to get further education?
Well, I suspect the driving force was almost a form of peer pressure. The Geological Survey of Canada was very much a PhD culture. Almost everybody there was doctor somebody, doctor this, doctor that. And I was one of the very few people on the staff that didn't have a doctoral degree. So I think right away I'm thinking, well, if I want to make my way in these waters, I'm going to have to get some more education. Also, luckily, the Canadian government had a graduate study support plan that allowed me to go back to school. I worked in the summer times for the GSC, but in the wintertime they provided support for me to go back to school. So it made it sort of financially feasible to do that. Like everybody, I looked at several schools and trying to decide where to go. And actually at that point, a lot of Canadians had gone to the University of Illinois that had a well-known groundwater program. But I guess having come from the prairies, the thought of spending the next few years in Urbana, Illinois didn't quite appeal to me so much. So instead I applied to Stanford and Berkeley, thinking that maybe I'd like to get out west in the mountains and see the coast and so on. And I ended up going to Berkeley, probably partly because David Todd was a professor there, and I'm sure people are familiar with that name as the author of the book Groundwater. It had just come out actually in 1959, and we're talking now in 1962. So his name was, getting pretty well known. As it turned out, David Todd was in a different department. He was in the civil engineering department, and I was in a sort of a geological engineering program. So when I did arrive at Berkeley, it turned out that I really wasn't likely I was going to be able to work directly under David Todd, although I took his courses, and he was a wonderful lecturer, and I learned a lot from him. I guess the other thing about going to Berkeley was Dawn and I arrived, we were married by that point, and in fact she was pregnant with you. And we arrived there, and we arrived right in the middle of the free speech movement, the famous, so the campus was a chaos. I arrived at the Hearst Mining Building, and there were all kinds of people standing there with picket signs saying, "Do not enter." And here I was, raised in a kind of a left-wing family and taught not to cross picket lines, and there I was with my young family and trying to decide how to handle this. And anyway, to make a long story short, I stayed, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, of course.
So I know one of the important things that happened was that you started to study under Paul Witherspoon. How is it that you came to meet?
Well, in actual fact, the first year I was there, I didn't hook up with Paul until the second year. The first year I took all of David Todd's courses and sort of discovered that he probably wasn't going to be available to be my graduate advisor. And I nearly switched to Stanford at that point. Stan Davis had taken up the professorship over at Stanford and was starting out a groundwater program. And I actually went over and sort of interviewed with him and thought about the possibility of switching over. And then, luckily, right at that point, a great piece of luck, Paul Witherspoon switched from petroleum engineering to groundwater. He was kind of forced into it, as I understand it. I think the petroleum engineering program was kind of closed up, and the 2 or 3 professors that were in that department had to decide what they were going to do with their lives, kind of. And he decided to go and get into groundwater. And I was sort of there looking for an advisor, and I talked to him. And of course, those of you that have met Paul, he's a great bear of a man, and he's fun, and he's smart. And again, it was a tremendously lucky break for me. And so it was certainly easier for Don and I to stay in Berkeley. We didn't look forward to the idea of moving to another university. But so that's why we stayed there, and it was in the second year that I hooked up with Paul.
Well, I'd like to tell a little story about Paul, actually, before we go on to talk more about your work. You might remember that maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when my 2 daughters were young, your granddaughters, you were at our house, and Paul Witherspoon was in town, and he contacted us, and he came over to the house, and your 2 granddaughters, my 2 daughters, immediately, he walked in the house, and they just ran up and hugged him and jumped on him, and he was, the best grandfatherly figure or great-grandfatherly figure that they could have. Just a wonderful man.
It doesn't surprise me.
But so, comment a little bit more on his, his style as a teacher and an advisor.
Oh, well, he was very supportive, and as I say, we had a lot of fun. I was also lucky there with the co-students I had. There were 3 of us studying under Paul: Shlomo Neumann, Iraj Ahmadel, and myself, which was kind of fun. We had an Israeli, an Iranian, and a Canadian studying in an American school. Let me just tell a couple of stories on Paul, because this was, you asked his style. His style was certainly different than most, I'm sure. It was right at that time that the computers were really kind of coming into play. Up until then, computers had not been a big deal in certainly in groundwater, that's for sure. And people were beginning to realize there was a tremendous amount of power there. And certainly Paul saw that future coming, even though he himself was not well trained in math or computers. So first thing he said to me was, "Well, you're going to have to take a math minor and learn some math and learn some computing." And I said, "Okay, I'd be happy to do that," and away I went. So I took a couple of courses, and I liked them and so on. The next year, Shlomo came, and of course one of the things he did was to ask me what courses I had taken and which were good ones and which weren't. And I named these math courses. So he went to Paul and said, "I want to take these same math courses that Al took." And Paul said, "No way." He says, "You've got to take some different math courses." He says, "Al already knows all that stuff, and he'll teach the rest of us all about that stuff, and you're to take some different ones." And in fact, Paul it was a joint learning process, because when I took that first math course, he found out what textbook we were using, and he bought a copy of the textbook, and every once in a while I had to go into his office and kind of tell him what we were covering, and in a certain sense teach him the math that we were learning, so he would learn it. So he wanted Shlomo to learn some different kinds of math. The second story I'll tell on him is his teaching method. He invented a teaching method that I don't think he knew exactly that that's what he was doing, but he certainly did. There was a book on porous media flow written by Morris Muscat. I can't quite remember the name of it, but it was a great big thick thing. And Paul thought for a grad course, maybe what we should do is just kind of start on page 1 and work our way through Muscat and learn all the stuff that was in there. Muscat's style in his book was to take the mathematical analysis down a certain distance, and then he would say, "It can be shown that." and there'd be another equation down below. Now sometimes when it could be shown that, there would only be maybe one or two missing lines between what was above and what was below. But sometimes there was pages and pages and pages of math. And what he did is, as each time we got to one of those spots, he would say, okay, Al, you work out for our next class what the missing steps are. Shlomo, you take this one down here. Well, I mean, we learned very fast that it was a lot easier to do the two-step ones than the 27-page ones. So what a tremendous teaching technique. I always went way ahead to see what was coming up, what the next few things in the book were that were going to say it can be shown that, to find out whether they were the two-liners or the 20-pagers, and then I volunteered for all the two-liners. So did Shlomo, so did Iraj. So we had lots of battles over who was going to do which one. What a fantastic teaching method. He forced us to get ahead of the game. Wonderful stuff. Anyway, I have to say that years later when I became a professor, I certainly tried to emulate the environment that he created. It was challenging and it was fun, and I was very lucky.
So you've mentioned a little bit about learning more about math and also your introduction to computers. So your PhD thesis topic was computer simulation of regional groundwater flow. How did you arrive at that as a thesis topic?
Well, I guess there was quite a few contributing things there. I had been working in the summertime, as I mentioned, up in the Old Wives Lake Basin of southern Saskatchewan, and it was certainly understood by Paul and I that, and I was being supported by the federal Canadian government, so it was certainly understood by both Paul and I that my thesis had to have something to do with the work I was doing in the summertime up north. I needed a Canadian connection, in other words, in my work. And it was right about that time that Joe Toth wrote his famous papers on regional groundwater flow that sort of built on what King Hubbard had done back in the 40s. And so I was aware of that work. And in actual fact, I think it was maybe in the second summer that I was at Old Wives Lake, I actually took my crew over to Calgary where there was a big Canadian hydrology conference on. And at that meeting, there was quite a famous debate between Joe Toth and Peter Mayboom. They each had their ideas of kind of how the regional groundwater flow was worked out on the Canadian prairies. Joe's ideas were, of course, based on the mathematical simulations that he had done, although he was also a strong field man. And Peter had come up with something he called the prairie profile, which was kind of a layered system. And they had some quite strong arguments about that. And in fact, Joe Toth recently wrote a history of sort of the what he called the Canadian School of Hydrogeology, which I think appeared in Groundwater magazine, and he talks about this debate. And anyway, I was there and heard it, and I couldn't help but feel as I was listening to it even, and certainly afterwards, that they were both right in some sense, and it had to do with the different assumptions they were making about the nature of the system. And so I was thinking about that. Meanwhile, back at Berkeley, I was taking this math minor, and I took a course on boundary value problems. And I must admit, I loved boundary value problems. This was analytical solutions to boundary value problems, Bessel functions and Fourier series and all that kind of stuff. And I loved it. And right away, I understood what Joe had done, which was an analytical solution to a boundary value problem. But I was also taking courses on numerical simulation, finite difference methods, and so on. And I guess I realized that I could bring the work of Toth and Mayboom together, and I could make simulations of regional groundwater flow systems that would apply to all types of water tables configurations and all types of geological configurations, and that was the difference between what they were talking about. So I went ahead and started working on it.
So here in 2012 we talk about computer simulations, but I suspect back in 1964-65 it wasn't quite that simple. Tell us a little bit about the computer facilities at the time of your thesis.
Well, of course, that's very early in the computer age. There were no PCs. There weren't even any you couldn't do it from your office. It was all mainframe based. The big computer system at the University of California at Berkeley was in the basement of the math building. It was all on punch cards. We had to keep our big, huge boxes of punch cards and cart them around with us and head over to the math building and feed them in through the card readers that were over there. Of course, we also did all our own Fortran programming. There were no canned programs available, so all of my PhD thesis was all based on programming that I did myself. with lots of stops and starts and lots of failures and goof-ups and stuff. I quickly learned that the best time to get good turnaround over at the computer center was in the middle of the night. So I spent lots of midnight runs going over to the basement of the math building to get my results. I also remember that they had an old CalComp plotter. It was one of the first plotters that there ever was. It wasn't even capable of drawing lines. It actually drew little dots, and the dots kind of lined their up to make a line. That's how you could see the lines. So those flow nets you see in the old papers by the Freeze and Witherspoon papers, actually I had to draw the lines through the dots. But I can remember when those first ones started to come out, they probably looked like an Escher mess, a weird diagram to everybody else. But to me, they were like Rembrandts.
Of course, maybe that makes it a little easier to fit your model data to your field data that way. So your thesis led to a series of papers in water resources research. Can you, with Paul Witherspoon as a co-author, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that was another stroke of luck in a way. Joe Toth's papers had actually appeared in the Journal of Geophysical Research, which is published by AGU, American Geophysical Union, and that would have been the logical place for us to publish our papers, except that right at that point, just a year before, the American Geophysical Union had spun off the hydrology work into a new separate journal, Water Resources Research. And so it was just getting started. And in fact, the first Freeze and Witherspoon paper was in volume 2 in 1966, and they followed along over the next couple of years. And certainly that was, it turned into the premier journal in our field, and I was in there at the beginning. It actually started a long involvement for me with the hydrology section of the AGU. I served in several capacities with them, up to being president of the section at one point, and actually spent 4 years as the editor of Water Resources Research later in my career. And I've always said if AGU hadn't invented the hydrology section, some of us would have had to invent it ourselves. It was the perfect place for a group of sort of hydrogeologists with a quantitative bent that wanted to make this a real science and get into the engineering of it and be involved in the computers and so forth.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to add about your time in Berkeley before we move on to your next?
Yeah, okay. Don and I started our family there. You and Christine were born there. And of course we have your younger brothers and sisters came later, Laurie and Sean, a few years later when we lived in Calgary. So maybe this is the time to say that, this interview is all about career and work and so on, but that's not really what my life was all about. My life was largely about my family, and this is the time to say so, I guess.
And again, I thank you for not talking politics, and also, people may be surprised to learn we didn't talk about groundwater around the dining room table very
Not very
often.
much.
So after Berkeley, we as a family moved to Calgary, and you took a job with Environment Canada. How did this transition happen?
Yeah, it was really the same job. I mentioned that I started with the Geological Survey of Canada, and while I was away at Berkeley, there were a whole slew of government reorganizations, and they led to the creation of Environment Canada. And our groundwater group, which had previously been in the Geological Survey of Canada, moved over to Environment Canada. So there wasn't really a new job in that sense, but it was certainly a new location. I was transferred out to the new Calgary office, which was just starting up, with Peter Mayboom as the head. It was on the campus of the University of Calgary, and so that's how we got to Calgary.
So fresh out of Berkeley, what did you work on back at Environment Canada?
Well, it's interesting there. One of the things that was interesting being a Canadian researcher is one had to pick your topics within a sort of a funding level that you knew you could get. We certainly didn't have the funding levels in Canada that my American colleagues had. So I was always looking for some kind of topics that were, constrained enough that I felt I could make a contribution, but didn't require, $1 million support. And one of the things that had come up during the Freeze and Witherspoon work was sort of curiosity about how the water got from the surface of the ground down to the water table. All the groundwater work kind of started at the water table. And so I started working on groundwater recharge when I got to Calgary, trying to better understand how that worked. And I was, of course, doing computer simulations, which I then had to, so I had to write computer programs for saturated, unsaturated flow, which was more complicated than things I had done before. But it followed along very much from work that was being done in the soil science world at that time. And I also had the good luck to hook up with a really good technician that we hired into our group named Jim Banner. And Jim and I worked on an instrumented field site and on some laboratory columns. So it was all kind of one-dimensional groundwater recharge work, trying to understand the mechanisms of that, how that works.
So you mentioned some limited funding. Were you able to go to conferences and other types of research-based meetings to to collaborate and see what others were doing in the field?
Yes, that was. I guess that's when I started going to AGU regularly. They have, at that time they had an annual meeting in both Washington and San Francisco. I guess maybe they still do. The San Francisco one was obviously very accessible for us from Calgary, so I started going there. Went to a couple of GSA meetings. Actually, the first international meeting I went with Peter Mayboom over to a meeting of the International Association of Scientific Hydrology, a big general assembly in Bern, Switzerland. And that was a kind of a surreal experience, actually. This was in 1967. That was kind of the height of the Cold War. And I guess the last thing I would have ever expected was that the Cold War was going to be fought out in this obscure hydrological meeting in Bern, Switzerland. But that's what happened. The Russian delegation or the Soviet delegation at that time, and the American delegation, they sat in their own separate corners and they trashed each other's work, and it was, as I say, in a certain sense, quite bizarre. Being a Canadian, I felt that I didn't really have to be part of all that, and so I was anxious to meet my first Russian hydrologists and see what they were really like. Of course, when I did meet them, they didn't want to talk about hydrology. They wanted to talk about hockey. They wanted to know whether the Red Army hockey team would have a chance if it played in the NHL, in the National Hockey League. Of course, I told them they wouldn't stand a chance. They'd get crushed. This was proven woefully wrong a couple of years later when they had the first Canadian-Russian hockey summit. It turns out the Russians were at least as good as the Canadians, if not better. The kind of conference that I really loved was the Penrose Conference style that the Geological Society of America started to run. And Paul Witherspoon actually organized a Penrose Conference on the Monterey Peninsula in 1972 on aquatards. And that's the first conference that I remember, sort of changing my life in a certain sense. I met people there. First time I met John Bredehoft, Guylain de Marcelly, a lot of other people that became lifelong friends and colleagues. And in the smaller group, you could really interact and find out what people were thinking, and it was very exciting.
So after your work with Environment Canada, I remember moving to New York State, and you went to work at the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center. How did you end up going there?
Well, again, it was an opportunity came up that I was very lucky, I always felt. I had gone to a conference in Tucson in 1969 that was right up my alley. It was about computers in hydrology. And so all the people that both in surface water and groundwater hydrology that work in computers were all there and presenting their papers, and I presented a paper there and so on. It's where I first met Tom Maddock, who became a lifelong friend. And certainly the most exciting thing that happened at that meeting was a paper given by Jim Wallace of IBM in Yorktown Heights, New York. He had been working with Benoit Mandelbrot, the now famous scientist, for his work on fractals. And Wallace and Mandelbrot presented some papers that really shook up the surface hydrology world. They presented some studies of stream flow time series that more or less suggested that all the dams that had ever been built had been sort of misdesigned, and it really shook up the establishment in the surface water hydrology world. So I was pretty surprised when, after the meeting, Jim Wallace actually came up to me after I'd given my talk and asked me if I'd have any interest in coming to Yorktown Heights to work on my computer kind of stuff there. I think this grew out of, when I was in Calgary, I wrote a paper with a fellow named Dick Harlan, and we called it a blueprint for a physically based hydrologic cycle sort of thing. We were going to try and model all of the parts of the hydrologic cycle, the groundwater flow, the recharge, the unsaturated flow, the stream flow, and somehow it was a kind of a dream. It was a blueprint. We didn't do it. We just said we'd love to do it. And I think Jim had seen that, and so they thought, well, the computer facilities at Yorktown Heights are among the best in the world. Why don't you come down there and see if you can pull it off? So that was kind of how it happened, and Jim invited me to come down, and Jim's boss was Sam Smart, a physicist who was working also in the small hydrology group at Yorktown Heights. So they invited me down for an interview. I didn't think I was going to get the job after the interview, because I went to the interview and there was about 10 or 15 people in the audience, and after I'd talked for about 2 minutes, about 12 of them fell asleep. Literally, more or less eyes closed and almost snoring. And I thought, oh man, have I ever blown this? Well, it turned out there was a reason. They'd been invited to the talk because they were from the computer center, and they had been told that there was a guy that might come to Yorktown Heights who would really test the boundaries of their computers, and that's what they wanted done. And after they heard me give a few introductions to what I was going to talk about, I think they realized that I really wasn't going to test the boundaries of their computers in the same way that some of their physicists did, and so they lost interest and fell asleep. But Jim and Sam stayed awake, and they did invite me to join their group, and I decided... by then I had fulfilled my obligations with the Canadian government for having sent me back to school, and we went off to New York.
So you've come from Old Wives Lake in Saskatchewan to New York City. How was that?
Well, it was pretty exciting, for sure. It was a very exciting. We lived in New York for 4 years, and the Broadway plays and the Yankee games and the Statue of Liberty and everything never got old. It was really fun.
So, we talked a little bit about the computer facilities back at Berkeley. Tell us a little bit about what it was like to work at IBM.
Well, certainly, IBM had reputed to have the second best computer facilities in the United States, second only to the Pentagon. I don't know if that was true or not, but it was certainly wonderful. They were still mainframe based at that time, but by then we had remote access from our offices. They weren't PCs because they weren't self-contained. It was just you could send your programs into the mainframe without having to cart the cards around and so on. It was top notch. It was also while I was at IBM that there was another scientist there that was making the first sort of three-dimensional graphics, and he used to post them on his wall outside his office there. And of course, now we're so used to three-dimensional graphics and things like that, but I was really there right at the beginning. I remember the graphics he did were of the Easter Island statues, and he had them so that he had the shadows in the right place and all this sort of thing. And we all thought that was just wonderful. That was a tremendous breakthrough. Working at IBM was really quite a dream. At that time, this was the glory years of IBM, and the Yorktown Heights lab was their flagship sort of research lab. The building itself was out on a hillside. You couldn't see another building from it. We often used to see deer running through the woods and so on. It was a great place. And after having worked for the government most of my career, I couldn't believe the incredible research freedom that we had there. We were basically to do what we wanted. And travel was something, if you felt the need to travel, you traveled, and no forms in triplicate. And of course, working with Sam Smart and Jim Wallace, it was a good few years for sure.
Well, tell us a little bit about the specific research that you started doing there that almost tested the limits of their computers.
Well, I guess I did start to sort of work on the ideas that we had presented in the blueprint. And it was a natural progression for me, having gone from the groundwater simulations, then getting involved with the saturated, unsaturated flow on a kind of a one-dimensional basis while I was in Calgary to try and understand the mechanisms. So what I worked on at Yorktown Heights was mainly a three-dimensional saturated, unsaturated, transient, subsurface flow computer model, and rainfall in and base flow out kind of. And I was still doing my own programming in Fortran and so on. and papers came out of that. The reaction to the papers that I wrote there was always interesting to me. There was kind of grudging acceptance that the results were interesting, but there was also a kind of a hint in the background that even a blind monkey could have done the work with considering the great computers we had there.
So then the next step presumably was to apply your model to the question of streamflow generation.
Yeah, there was others had developed programs of streamflow, and I sort of took their math, if you want, and added it in, tried to make the two systems interact, the subsurface system and the groundwater and the streamflow system. I think you have to think back to those days. Things were very separate still at that time. I mean, when you went to AGU, for instance, there was groundwater sessions and there was surface water sessions, and very few people went between those rooms. And I guess I was hoping that I could start to build a bridge across that gap and get, hydrology a bit more integrated. That certainly was happening partly under the influence of Sam and Jim, who both worked on surface water problems. I was the only groundwater guy in our group. The mechanism of streamflow generation was a hot topic at the time. The whole question of whether subsurface storm flow or overland flow were the dominant mechanisms and what controlled the different types. And I made contact with Tom Dunn at that time, who was the sort of leading field researcher in the area at the University of Washington. University of Washington in Seattle. And I wrote articles on my computer simulations, but I really didn't have these simulations hooked to an actual field site. And there were some letters to the editor that came in that sort of took some flack over the lack of field confirmation of the kind of things I was suggesting were controlling these mechanisms based on my simulations.
So were you able to ultimately apply your model to an actual field site?
Yeah, I mean, I realized when these letters came in that I needed to do that, and I made contact with a fellow, Gord Stevenson of the U.S. Agricultural Service in Boise, Idaho. He had a small instrumented watershed up on the hillside there that he thought might be suitable for trying to apply these models. And so we did so. We worked together on that and published a paper on it. The results were okay, but they weren't spectacular. There were lots of problems in calibrating the model against the actual field data that was available. And in the paper that we wrote, we were pretty honest about that, and maybe the first one to really raise a lot of the issues, the problems and so on that come with trying to simulate saturated, unsaturated flow in an actual field site. Rainfall runoff modeling, I think, continues to be a controversial topic even today. What can and can't be achieved with different types of models. I returned to that topic later when I was at UBC with Keith Logue, a later PhD student who's now a professor at Stanford. And over his career, he's applied many types of rainfall runoff models at many watersheds and has done a lot to sort of explain the strengths and weaknesses of the different approaches.
I think while you were at IBM, you also got involved with subsidence modeling of Venice, Italy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's another incredible piece of good fortune. I guess at that time, it was widely known that the city of Venice had several environmental threats, one of which was the land subsidence that was causing the city to sink. It really didn't sink very much compared to a lot of other land subsidence spots in the world, just a few centimeters. But, of course, sitting on the island at elevation 0, essentially, and being flooded quite regularly by the seiches that came up the Adriatic Sea, there was a desire there was a Save Venice sort of movement in the world and in Italy itself. And so the Italian government had set up a kind of a program to look at the problems of Venice and try and save this historic city from any further ravages. And IBM had a scientific center in Venice, and they volunteered to do computer simulations of the various issues, the air pollution and the seiches and the land subsidence. And they assigned a young scientist, Beppe Gambalati, to start looking into making a model of the land subsidence. he discovered that that there was another groundwater person in the IBM world. I was working at Yorktown Heights, and he contacted me to see if I was interested. He recognized, of course, that the land subsidence was involved with groundwater withdrawals. That was certainly widely known. And so that's how I got involved with that, and it involved lots of trips over to Venice and working with Beppy for many years.
Well, as a young boy, I don't know anything about the subsidence modeling you did, but I do remember taking a trip to Venice, and so we'll have to thank IBM for that.
That's
also.
right.
So tell us a little bit more about the specific simulations and couplings that you guys were investigating in that problem.
Well, I was working with Beppy Gambaletti, but also with a fellow named Paulo Gatto, who was the geologist who was very familiar with the geological environment at Venice. And of course, it was the usual subsidence situation where you have interbedded clays and sands, and they were pumping a lot of water out of the sands for the industrial development on the coast near Venice, and that the cone of drawdown in the sands was causing the interbedded clays to compact. So we had to develop a three-dimensional program for a sort of layered stratigraphy like that would somehow link the transient response of the groundwater pumping to the stress-strain field that was causing the subsidence, the compaction of the clays. Now, there had been a lot of work on this, and as early as the work of Biot back in the 40s, linking the stress-strain fields with the groundwater fields, but there hadn't really been too many computer programs written that could be used in a simulation mode, sort of for a predictive mode. Our goal was to try and assess the alternative scenarios of reduced pumping that were being proposed. And in any case, we did try to develop that. Beppy was certainly the leader. I was the helper, if you want. And ultimately, there was some papers published in WRR and even one in Science in 1974. Of course, what I really remember about those times was what you remember, was sitting on St. Mark's Square and listening to the music, and it was a wonderful time, drinking wine and so on. But Beppy's remained a lifelong friend, and in fact, I just saw him recently.
So you mentioned, assessing alternative scenarios and things like that. Nowadays, in computers, there's all kinds of stochastic approaches, but I suspect back then this was sort of new to hydrogeology. Is that correct? Looking at alternative scenarios, maybe just one-off type approaches as opposed to a detailed geostatistical or Monte Carlo type simulation?
Yes, I don't think we had any stochastic aspects to what we were doing there. That was back in the world of model calibration. We were still all delightfully deterministic, thinking that what we were doing was the truth somehow. And maybe this is the time to stick in 2 cents worth about sort of the role of computers in hydrogeology. I'm sure I'm known primarily as a modeler, and my research was certainly in that direction. But I think I always had my feet on the ground of realizing that modeling is, simply a tool, one of the many tools that you use in solving a groundwater problem. And certainly at Venice, I mentioned working with Paulo Gatto. Without him, we would have been lost. He was the one who knew what was realistic and what wasn't, and what the geology looked like. But as I say, we didn't have very many drill holes, and there would have been a lot of uncertainty there if we had been thinking that direction at that time. Having said that, maybe I should just throw in that the scenarios that were published in the paper in Science actually turned out to be pretty good when the reductions in pumpage were actually achieved through alternate water supplies at Venice. The subsidence did drop, and it dropped along a curve that wasn't too far off the one that we had predicted would happen with that pumping scenario.
So, drawing back on my childhood, I remember leaving IBM and packing up the car and driving all the way around through Florida and Texas and California to get up to British Columbia, to Vancouver, where you took a job at UBC. What was the motivation to leave IBM and embark on a professorship?
Well, it was a hard decision, I can tell you that. I loved my time at IBM, and I probably would have happily stayed there longer. But I had always thought that I would probably like to get into teaching at some time. And if I did that, I kind of wanted to do it in Canada. I actually had several job offers from various American universities over the years, but I thought if I was going to teach, I wanted to teach Canadians. And so when a chance came up at UBC, even though the timing was maybe a little early for when I wanted to move to that job, obviously they don't come up very often, and I felt I had to apply for it, and I did. So in 1973, I accepted an offer to join the faculty at UBC in the Geological Sciences Department, but my involvement was with the Geological Engineering program, which was an interdisciplinary program based in geological sciences, but all my students were in geological engineering, and all my administrative duties were in engineering rather than science. So that was the beginning of professorial life. I actually loved academic life. Some people, don't like one or more aspects of it, but it's kind of a mix of teaching and research and administrative duties, and I actually liked all three aspects of it.
So I was actually an undergrad engineer at UBC during some of the time when you were there, but I carefully avoided geological engineering and having you as a professor. However, many of my friends did take your courses and enjoyed them. Seeing that you had a lot of positive experiences related to your teaching.
Yeah, I really liked teaching. I enjoyed. Again, I was lucky. Most of the courses that I was assigned to teach were upper level undergraduate or graduate courses. I didn't ever teach a first or second year course. I'm not sure I would have liked that as well, where I had to sort of be much more judgmental and failing students and sort of changing people's careers against their wishes. By the time students got to me, that kind of winnowing out had happened, and it was more a much more cooperative thing between myself and the students. We were working our way towards their graduation, and I enjoyed that part. I particularly remember I taught a fourth-year course, not my groundwater course, but a fourth-year course that was for the geological engineers, in which we tried to simulate the situations that would exist after they got out in the real world. I divided the class up into small companies, and I acted as like the client, and I presented them with the problem, and they had to put in proposals and bid on the job and estimate the costs and things like that. And then I would award the job to one of the companies and so forth and so on. And I enjoyed that kind of thing. It was fun.
So you're well known for the textbook Groundwater, co-authored with John Cherry, that was published in 1979. When did you start thinking about writing a textbook?
Well, I guess when I started teaching at UBC, developing a program of groundwater courses, both sort of a flow course and a contamination course, I was using David Todd's textbook, which is the one I had been used to for my own studies at Berkeley, and the emphasis in Todd's textbook is clearly on, water supply. And what I found was that my groundwater classes were growing into a much broader base. I did have civil engineers and hydrogeologists that were interested in water supply per se, but there were also geologists that were interested in other aspects of groundwater, the role of groundwater in forming ore deposits, for example. I had engineers who were interested in other things than water supply, seepage through earth dams and other kinds of drainage problems. I had foresters in the class and geographers that were interested in sort of the role of groundwater in the hydrologic cycle and how it influenced their studies of basin-wide hydrology. I had Aggies that were interested in soil science and the role of groundwater in agricultural drainage and that sort of thing. So I began to wonder after a couple of years, as I was developing a course that suited this audience and realizing that I was not really being able to use as much of Todd's text anymore, and that there were parts of my teaching that I didn't seem to have a textbook for, whether a publisher would be interested in a book of a broader type like that.
So how is it that you and John Cherry came to collaborate on the textbook?
Well, I had known John over the years. He actually was at Berkeley the first year that I was at Berkeley. At the same time that I mentioned that I was kind of wondering whether it was wise to stay there or not, John was going through the same the same decision process. And he actually decided to move and go back to the University of Illinois, where the big groundwater program that was better known was. So I got to know him there. I also ran into John in our summer work on the Canadian prairies. He also was out there with field studies with different groups than I was with. But so we knew each other, but not all that well. But the real reason I contacted him was I recognized my weakness in chemistry. I had never had a very good background in chemistry. And I knew that John had just returned from France, where he'd taken a postdoctoral position, and he studied with Henri Scholer, who was considered at that time kind of the leading hydrogeochemist in the world. So I always say that I made John my generous offer, that maybe he wanted to write one chapter of a book in groundwater. I was going to write a book, and he would write a chapter. And I guess I pictured the front page saying Groundwater by R. Allan Freeze, and then in big print, and then in little tiny print somewhere with one chapter by John Cherry. Well, much to my surprise, he refused this generous offer, and instead he made a counteroffer. And the counteroffer was that we would write a book together, and I would write half of it, and he would write half of it. And one half of it would be on the physics of groundwater flow and its application in engineering and flow, and the other half would be on the chemistry of groundwater and its application in groundwater contamination. John could see the future better than I could. I didn't realize this coming explosion of work in groundwater contamination. John did. So I owe to him, in my opinion, the success of our book. He made it into a book that was different than any other book that was on the market, and the timing was absolutely perfect.
So a few moments ago we talked a little bit about geostatistics and alternate scenarios and uncertainty, but I guess at UBC you started to do a little more research into that area. Is that correct?
Yeah, that whole business started back when I was at IBM, actually. People always say, how did you get involved in this geostatistics work? And the answer is very simple. It was because my next-door neighbor was Jim Wallace, a surface water hydrologist who worked almost totally with stochastic ideas in his work. And he found it quaint that we groundwater hydrologists believed all our deterministic predictions and just assumed that they were working right and didn't do anything to tell our clients, if you want, how good or bad our simulations were. And so I did that first uncertainty work, predictive uncertainty work at IBM, primarily to get Jim Wallace off my back. When I got to UBC, the first PhD student I had was Leslie Smith. And Les later, of course, became my colleague at UBC and is still at UBC. Has had a great career himself. And anyway, he and I decided that he would work on sort of carrying forward this geostatistical ideas and looking at the predictive uncertainty of groundwater models. Certainly the work I did in 1975 back at IBM was very naive, and there were lots of work by others at the same time and later, Lynn Gelhard, Guylain de Marcelly, Gideon DeGan, Shlomo Neumann, that took these ideas much farther along, and Leslie became part of that sort of improvement of all those ideas and starting to think about how uncertainty can be brought into the prediction game, if you want.
So then, did you also to look to apply some of these predictive uncertainty ideas to other areas, like back to your coupling of surface and groundwater flow?
Yes, I mean, again, you're always trying to kind of put your ideas together. I guess when I came to UBC, I was working on the streamflow modeling. I was working on the geostatistics, so I got less working on the geostatistics side. Shortly after that, Keith Loeb came along, and I had a couple other students also. I started working with there was a professor in the soil science department named Jan de Vries, and Jan had an experimental watershed near Vancouver, and he was very good to let our students go up there to learn things and see the field and try to do some computer modeling for it and so on. And certainly the idea was to put together the streamflow generation ideas and the predictive uncertainty ideas together. Keith Loeb's PhD thesis is actually an interesting story. When I suggested a topic to him, the topic I suggested was, let's compare different rainfall runoff models and see how much better the more sophisticated models are than the what I considered less sophisticated models. And by more sophisticated, what I meant was big deterministic blueprint type models that had a physical representation of all the components of the hydrologic cycle. Now I knew that those kind of models would cost more to develop and run, and they would require more data, which would cost more. And this was the beginning of starting to think about sort of cost-benefit analysis. And the idea that I presented to Keith was, let's get a watershed and use a sophisticated model and a simple model and see how much they each cost and see how much benefit you get from the added cost of the fancier model. So Keith took off to start trying to do that. And of course, the first thing we discovered was that the big fancy model didn't work any better than the simple one. Because we never had enough data. It would have worked better probably if we could have had $1 million worth of data, but given the kind of data suites that were available on most watersheds, it didn't work any better than some of the much simpler stochastic streamflow models. And so his topic of his thesis changed somewhat as we went along.
So you mentioned decision analysis. I think probably about this time you started to get into, I guess, more formal decision analysis applications in research. Is that correct?
Yes, and this came about, I would say, primarily because it was about this time that I also started doing some consulting. The first few years I was at UBC, I didn't do very much consulting, but it was common for people in engineering to take on some consulting. I think we were allowed to do, I don't remember, a day a week or something if we wanted to. So I started taking on consulting jobs, and of course, most of my consulting, I was being asked to be a part of a team that was looking at some kind of a site, very often a contaminated site, and they were trying to decide how to remediate it. And I was the one that was being asked to sort of help them develop models. I wasn't doing the modeling, but I was helping some kind of a company that had been hired to do that, set up a reasonable model. And of course, because all this uncertainty work was floating around the research world, I was thinking, well, let's try and apply some of these uncertainties and give a more honest answer to our clients. Well, the first thing I discovered was that they weren't very excited about this. They weren't very pleased with having their expensive consultants tell them that here was the answer, but in actual fact, they weren't sure if that was the right answer. It could be quite different than that. And unless we were willing to spend a lot more money on getting some more data, we had a lot of uncertainty. I think they regarded it as sort of experts inventing a way to wiggle off the hook, kind of, especially like a lot of these things ended up in court. And the last thing the lawyers wanted was an expert witness who stood up there and waffled about what he had found and was spinning all these uncertainty tales. So I began to realize that just uncertainty per se was not going to sell very well in the real world, and that the research that was totally in that direction was probably a bit of a dead end, if you want. And what I realized, of course, again out in that consulting world, what was really required was a lot of difficult decisions. And I started to try and learn a little bit about decision analysis, and I was very lucky. Right about that point, I got a sabbatical. My first sabbatical came up, and so I decided to take it at the University of Arizona. A new grad student named Joel Massman had just joined the team, and he and I both went and took the sabbatical down at University of Arizona, where we learned a lot from Tom Maddock and others down there about uncertainty and stochastic analysis and all that sort of stuff. But I did my homework there on decision analysis and how that worked, and how we could take the uncertainty work one step further into helping people make decisions. My thought was that then when we went out into the real world, we would have a tool that they would find useful rather than one that just caused them trouble.
And so with these insights you learned at the University of Arizona, did that help you in actually applying your decision making?
Well, what I learned, I guess, in that year was that decision making is not a technical exercise per se. Even decisions that most technical people would think of are purely technical. Things like how many liners should we have on the base of a landfill or something like that. These are not. They have a technical component, but there's also a social, economic, political component, legal components. And I also had a former student named Tony Hodge who had gone in that direction after he graduated from the grad program at UBC. And I interacted with him a bit as well on this. Anyway, the result of all this was a kind of a package that we put out on hydrogeological decision analysis, with Joel and I being the prime developers of the ideas, and then Tony Sperling came along as another student and took these ideas and applied them to a specific engineering problem involving mine dewatering. And Bruce James, one of my last graduate students, looked at the worth of data and how this decision analysis can help you decide when you've got enough data, when to stop, when to keep going. But certainly, it opened up a new can of worms for hydrogeologists to have to think about all these social and legal and political things.
You know, this is certainly an important thing that we still deal with today. So, when you first dived into the socioeconomics associated with hydrogeology, how was that received?
Well, with lots of controversy. I think we were very lucky that the first time that Joel and I went and presented some of these ideas was at just a sort of informal meeting at the University of Washington in Seattle that had been set up by Steve Burgess and Tom Dunn and myself, just to bring our respective graduate student groups together and give them a chance to maybe practice their talks before they went off to AGU or GSA. So Joel presented the material, and I was standing in the background, and all of a sudden everybody was up in arms about what's he talking about, the value of life and putting an economic value on, on all kinds of stuff that didn't seem to have anything to do with science or engineering. And there was definitely a feeling that we had waded into waters that were too deep. So that was a good warning. We never did back off on that. The stuff that was ultimately, published, we kept in the economic and legal and social material. But I think we were warned that we had to be much more careful at how we presented it and sort of realize that people were going to be a little bit surprised to see it. I mean, I was aware that there were these two worlds, because back when I was editor of WRR, we actually had two editors. I say I was editor, I was co-editor. My co-editor was Jared Cohen, and he was a social scientist who worked in water resources. And people sent papers to him on all kinds of things, economics and legal aspects of water resources. And essentially there was just two worlds there. Nobody ever crossed that boundary, and so I guess I was aware that there was another world out there, and again, I was anxious to try and cross that boundary. And I think things have slowly changed over the years, and now there would be much less resistance to a lot of these ideas.
So you've mentioned several of your grad students and colleagues at UBC. Could you take a minute just to summarize some of your best memories of your time at UBC?
Well, I have lots of good memories of UBC. It was a great time. I suppose the best thing is you watch the successes of your former students. I run into back when I was consulting, I ran into my undergraduate geological engineering students all the time. I really feel that the geological engineering curriculum at most Canadian universities, not quite so common in the United States, is a perfect background for groundwater work. I mean, it's the only branch of sort of the earth sciences, geophysics would be the other one, I guess, that gets into the math and computers and stuff enough to be able to swim in the groundwater world sort of thing. Also, I've watched several of my ex-PhD students be very successful in academia. Les Smith at UBC, Keith Logue, Grant Garvin, Tony Hodge. And also a lot of people that took graduate studies at UBC went on to be very successful in the consulting world. Tony Sperling and Joel Massman both have their own companies. Bruce James, Gord Jameson, Mark Udding, Randy Byrne, all these fellows have made a good success for themselves. I even have one student, Jennifer Rulon, who went on to become a medical doctor.
So I also have a memory of those years that I'd like to have you comment on. I remember you used to have this fancy trophy on your desk at home that I think we ended up putting souvenir hockey pucks inside the cup of it. But I later learned that this was in fact the Meinzer Award.
Yes, the Meinzer Award came with a bowl. It was called the Birdsall Bowl. And it was presented to me. I was very lucky to receive some awards from both the American Geophysical Union and the Geological Society of America and some other organizations. And I'm very proud of those, and I thank those organizations for recognizing my work and deciding it was worth that sort of recognition. Probably the award I remember the best, I received an award from GSA back in 2004, and after the sort of formal presentation, all of a sudden two of my ex-students, Gord Jameson and Grant Garvin, jumped up on the stage to make a kind of a subsidiary presentation. And what it was a Vancouver Canucks hockey sweater. They knew I had been a big fan, or still am a big fan of the Vancouver Canucks hockey team, but they had got one of the Vancouver Canucks sweaters, and on the back they had emblazoned all the names of all my graduate students and the years that they had graduated. And I thought that was a pretty neat recognition.
And I can substantiate for any of them that, in fact, that is still the most prominent thing hanging in your office is the Canucks jersey. Maybe one year they'll actually win the Stanley Cup.
Maybe.
So, after many years at UBC, you retired from UBC and went into consulting. When did you leave, and what caused you to make that change?
Well, it's almost 20 years ago now. In 1992, I left UBC, left academia behind. It was a tough decision. I very much enjoyed my years at UBC. I guess the time was right. I had come off a 3-year administrative assignment where I had been been involved with the scholarship programs at the graduate level over the whole university in the Faculty of Graduate Studies. And I would be coming back into my department and kind of starting up again where I had left off a few years earlier. And I guess I felt the time was right, that my consulting was kind of taking off. And there's a certain circle at a university. You go around the loop a few times, you change the curriculum, and all of a sudden you see all the circle coming back at you again. And I guess I thought maybe it was time to, take the consulting forward. And so I decided to do that. And I haven't regretted it, although I missed the university life at times.
Well, we continued to have food on the table, so I guess it worked. What is it that caused your consulting practice to be successful at that time?
Well, I guess there's two reasons that are for sure reasons. One was the U.S. Superfund law. The U.S. Superfund law was passed in 1980, required American companies that had big plants and so on that to investigate whether their sites were polluted or contaminated, and whether their groundwaters were contaminated, and if so, to clean them up. So very quickly, I was getting a lot of calls from people at Superfund sites to ask if I could come down and help them or be part of a team to help clean them up or get them under control. I worked in the San Gabriel, San Fernando Valley with Terry Foreman of CH2M Hill was really my first sort of job. Jerry Griezak of Intera. I worked on contaminated sites at Toms River, New Jersey, Rochester, New York, Tacoma, Washington, a couple of Canadian sites, Ville-Mercier, Quebec, and Smithville, Ontario. So there was lots to keep me busy. The second big thing was the U.S. and Canadian nuclear waste programs. I had many assignments and sat on lots of committees and panels and reviews and so on having to do with those two programs.
And I think we almost crossed paths on at least one or two of those.
Yes.
I know that a number of these consulting assignments involved expert panels. How did those work out?
Well, I very much enjoyed the expert panel work, very stimulating experience, partly because there was some awfully sharp people on those panels and you got to work with them. Of course, John Cherry and I did a lot of work together. Our names are sort of forever linked, it seems, but also with Stavros Papadopoulos and Dave McWhorter and many other co-panelists. Of course, one of the things I discovered is that there is much unrecognized talent in the consulting world. There are lots of brilliant guys working for companies, either amongst our clients where the problems existed, or in the other consulting companies that were brought in to help solve the problem. I really enjoyed working with a lot of these folks. Sitting on these expert panels was always a kind of a difficult balancing act. If our client was a company like, I worked for Kodak at Rochester or Ciba-Geigy Chemical Corporation at Toms River, then the panelists were generally seen by others as hired guns. the suspicion was that we were just going to go there and represent the interest of our clients against all odds. And so I tried to be very careful to pick clients who were really looking for solutions to their problems, not just trying to escape their sins. And that's hard to do, and often our job in the panel was basically to give management some bad news. You know, the bad news being that they had a lot of contamination on their sites and they were going to have to clean it up by law, and it was going to cost a lot of money, and the benefits, you know, there's no direct benefits. They can't make any money out of it, sort of thing. At the same time, we had to work productively with the regulators and, you know, sort of protect the clients, if you want, from sometimes the regulators might be making demands that simply couldn't be met from a technical point of view. So it was a difficult balancing act, and I enjoyed that and the politics, and there was always lawyers in the room and so on. Some engineers didn't like that kind of work. I did.
So I remember talking with you about one specific assignment. You mentioned the lawyers that, you know, I think was almost more legal than technical. It seemed that was one of the more interesting assignments you had. Can you tell us a little bit about
it was
that?
It was actually the last major assignment that I took on. I acted as an arbitrator on a 3-man arbitration board in near Houston, Texas, to adjudicate the costs between the various so-called potentially responsible parties that had been involved at a contaminated chemical plant near Houston. It was very, very interesting. I spent 5 weeks in Houston sitting as a judge, if you want, as an arbitrator, and listening to the two sides of this conflict present their cases exactly like it would be in a court case, with many, many lawyers, many, many expert witnesses. And it was very interesting to watch the interaction of the technical and legal aspects of a case like that. I found that very interesting.
So I suspect that most of the people that watch this video will be very familiar with the Freeze and Cherry textbook, Groundwater. But I know from talking with you in recent years, you know, on a professional level, that you have 2 other labors of love, 2 other books that you've actually written that I think you are quite proud of, and I've read them, and they're great books. Tell us a little bit about those 2 books.
Yeah, well, I guess as I started to ramp down, luckily when you work for yourself as a consulting engineer, you can kind of ramp down. You don't have to cold turkey your retirement. So, you know, starting when I was about 60 and lasting till I was about 70, which is just a couple of years ago, I kind of ramped down my consulting practice and was working more or less part-time. And during that time, I decided I wanted to write. I've always enjoyed writing, and I wanted to try my hand at reaching a popular audience. They always say you should write about what you know first, anyway. So the first book I wrote was called The Environmental Pendulum, and the subheading was A Quest for the Truth About Toxic Chemicals, Human Health, and Environmental Protection. And that was published in 2000 by the University of California Press. And I guess I felt there was I'd gained a lot of experience over my years in consulting in this world and researching in it, and that the public didn't have a particularly good understanding of kind of what was involved at these sites, what could and couldn't be done at contaminated sites, and what was and wasn't possible, and what mattered and what didn't. And I tried to write a book that sort of went through all that kind of thing. I felt there was a need for better information in the public domain on environmental decision making, a balanced account, if you want, of all these issues. And so I did. The second book was definitely more controversial. I wrote a book with the help of Jay Lair called The Fluoride Wars. And the subheading gives away my position, I guess. How a modest public health measure became America's longest-running political melodrama. And here was a case where I really was acting more like a journalist, if you want, than a scientist, although the book is, you know, covers all the science, and I understood it all very well, but I wasn't a participant in the fluoridation controversy, and I found it interesting, and I wanted to, again, present a balanced account, explain what both sides' viewpoints were, and make an attempt to provide balanced coverage of this long-standing controversy. This was a much tougher audience, that turns out. The people who are involved in the fluoridation controversy are very, very committed, and I don't think I made either side very happy by presenting both sides of the story with Jay Lair's help.
Well, I think we're at the end of the chronology now. We're up to the present day. I'd really like to thank you for doing this interview, and I'd really like to thank you for asking me as a groundwater professional, and more importantly, as your son, to be the interviewer. I very much enjoyed this. Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing?
I guess there's maybe a couple of things that haven't come up that I wanted to make sure I get in here. First, I spent 3 wonderful semesters teaching at the Universidad Politécnica de Valencia with Jaime Gomez Hernandez and Andres Sahuquillo. I loved Spain and the Spanish people, and I certainly want to say so on this video. And second, I guess, just to say again that I'm really pleased to be involved in this attempt to keep the historical record of our field. I've been actively involved in historical hydrogeology over the years. Way back in 1983, Bill Back invited me to get involved with preparing 2 benchmark volumes. There was a series at that time called the Benchmark Papers in Geology, and we put together a physical hydrogeology and a chemical hydrogeology, a collection of a set of the most famous papers in those fields. And then somewhat later, I wrote an article on Henry Darcy in Groundwater in 1994, and I'm very proud of these historical contributions, and now I'm glad to be a part of this time capsule presentation. And I guess lastly, again, I would like to emphasize the wonderful role of friends and family and my wife Donna, and watching my kids grow up and succeed and be good people. I mean, that's what it's all about. And that, and of course, your golf handicap. And I want to thank you, Geoff, for doing this with me.
Thank you.
Thanks.